Welcome to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green, the show where great dentistry meets great business. Listen in each week as we bring you an inspiring person who will share their story, ideas and business techniques to help you create a practice and a life you love. And now introducing your host, Dr. Jesse Green.
Hello everyone, it's Jesse Green here. Welcome back to SavvyDentist.com and to the Savvy Dentist podcast. It's great to have your company for another episode of the show. Now, if you're a first-time visitor to the show, welcome. It's great to have you here. And if you've been around the show for a little while, well, welcome back. It's great to have you here as well. Now, you'll recall that we've been talking about a road trip that I recently took to the United States with some of our boardroom clients. These are the clients that have really scaled their enterprise. They've got large practices, 8 figures and beyond, and for some, and others, not far off that. And so, of course, as you grow a business that big, we need to be looking at different systems and different processes and different ways of thinking. But those ways of thinking, processes, etc., are still really relevant to smaller businesses as well. So what I wanted to do in this series was to unpack some of the lessons of the road trip. Now, you'll remember from previous episodes, the road trip was across 3 locations. And the first location we went to was Disney in Anaheim in California. And from Disney, we then traveled to Seattle. And while we're in Seattle, we visited the Pike Place Markets, and particularly we stopped off at the world-famous fish market, which if you've heard of the fish philosophy or any of those sorts of things, it's where that originated from. And then the last stop was to Las Vegas, where we visited Zappos. And Zappos, as many people know, is the world's largest online retailer of shoes. It was acquired by Amazon, I think it was about 2008, 2009, for $1 billion or so. What Zappos is really famous for is their customer service, and they regard themselves as a customer service business that happens to sell shoes. And of course, they're also incredibly well known for their culture. And their CEO, Tony Hsieh, who unfortunately and very sadly passed away not so long ago, was instrumental in creating a business that really stood the test of time. We kind of did this series backwards. So we started at Zappos, then we spoke about Seattle and the markets. And in this episode, I want to go back to the beginning, which is Disney. So all 26 of us arrived in Anaheim. So it was a bit of a large touring company. It was great fun though. We had an amazing time. And one of the things I've always been fascinated about Disney is that Disney as an organization and the park there in Anaheim makes more money than the entire city of Las Vegas. And when you think about that, that's pretty remarkable because Las Vegas has gambling, it has prostitution, it has all those other types of activities, and Disney is really considered good, clean fun. So how is it that Disney is able to do this and maintain a reputation as being the happiest place on earth? And I was really keen to understand that from a leadership point of view. I was really keen to understand that from a customer experience point of view, from a pricing point of view, from just about every point of view that you could think about. What we did is we spent a day at the park experiencing the park. And of course, a couple of things are really interesting. When you go to the park, I'm sure many of you have been to the park, you can get the magic pass and go to the front of the queue and have the express lanes and all the rest of it. And I guess one of the first lessons came out of that, and that is there are always people, there's always a market for someone who wants to upgrade. There's always a fast lane. There's always a premium opportunity in your practice. And not everyone is cost sensitive, or lots of people may be, but there's always a market for people that want to go to the front of the queue, the people that want to go to the expressway. So I guess one of the things I was thinking about in our practice is, well, what's the equivalent of that? How do we provide an exceptional service knowing that some people want more? And you could do that through lots of different ways. And one of the ways that we're toying with at the moment is the idea of reserved appointments for certain clients. Maybe we have a premium appointment slot. Maybe it's the before work slot or something of that nature. So we can do those sorts of things. We can create a premium experience. Now, the other thing that I noticed going around the park itself was, of course, there is an opportunity to buy everywhere. You come off a ride, you go through a stall, and you can buy the merchandise from any number of different parts of Disneyland, whether it's the Star Wars part, whether it's any other part. And so I guess one of the things I was reflecting on is how easy and how frictionless Disney makes the buying experience. And one of the things I've noticed for lots of dentists and dental practices is there's friction in the sales. The friction could be the handover between the front desk. The friction could be the education process. The friction could be asking for the sale. The friction could be patient finance. The friction could be appointment availability, whatever it is, right? But the point I'm trying to make is all those little moments of friction slow down the sales process. So how do you make that buying process for your patients as frictionless and as easy as possible? Identify those constraints and address them. Disney has identified all of those constraints and has addressed them very, very elegantly. On top of that, at Disney, you'll be aware that Disney has the fast lane, the Magic Pass, but nothing there is particularly inexpensive, but people pay the prices happily. And I think this is a key thing. It's about perception of value, price versus value. And when you're in Disney, you're having an expectation of going to the happiest place on earth, which of course puts pressure on Disney to deliver just that. Now that comes with some training, it comes with some other things that we'll talk about in a moment. But if that dream or that experience is delivered upon, then you feel happy to pay the money. And so one of the things I've been reflecting on is, if you're going to charge a premium, and you've got to make sure that you're delivering on your promise. You've got to make sure you're delivering and then some. Because what I think where people come unstuck is if they're charging a premium price and not delivering, or people don't feel there's a value exchange, that's where we get into a little bit of difficulty. For those people that are non-preferred providers and they charge premium prices, I think the reason why some people are price sensitive is not necessarily because of the price, it's because of the perception of value. And so in the training that we do with our clients, we talk about the uniqueness and value matrix and how do you create an experience that is both valuable and unique? How do you set yourself apart? And it's about creating that patient experience. It's about understanding what drives that experience. And many of you'd be aware that at Disney, the staff are called cast members. And, they have a role to perform. And I use the word perform really deliberately because it's about choreography. It's about being deliberate and it's about being intentional. So when we went to the Disney Institute the following day to unpack what we'd seen, one of the key messages that came out was this concept of intentionality. And intentionality was being on purpose with all that you do, thinking about the outcome rather than thinking about the task. It sounds very simple, but it's hard to execute consistently across such a large organization like Disney. It's even hard to implement consistently in a small organization like a dental practice. So really what drives that? It comes back to values, it comes back to vision, and of course the values don't change. And so there's a couple of key things when it came to the values of the organisation that were really, really important. So I thought what I'd do is I'd just talk about a couple of things around that. So there's a few things, when you're considering your own values, there's a few things to consider. One is that if the leadership team of the practice have values that are different or misaligned from the organisational values, then the organisational values will be pushed aside and the leadership team will flavour the culture of the practice. It's just that simple. So we need to make sure we have incredible alignment of values. We need to be really, really aligned. We need to make sure that if we're not aligned, we can either achieve alignment, which is hard because values are often very personal. But if they're not aligned, then maybe we need to consider moving someone on. And that sounds really dramatic and drastic, but again, in Savvy Dentist, we talk about this matrix called the performance culture matrix, which is a 2x2 grid with performance on one axis and culture on the other. And if you've got someone who's actually good in their role, but they're a culture misfit, they're the ones that practice owners really struggle with. And I've spoken about that before on the podcast, but Disney alluded to the same thing. They've got to have a culture fit. They've got to be a values fit. So if, for instance, if you happen to have a value that you really don't like hanging around kids or you don't really believe in fun, well then clearly Disney's not going to be a great place for you to work. So what's really interesting is the values remain stable, but the vision for the business expands. Now, we in Savvy Dentist, we also talk about the culture creation telescope. We talk about values and vision, stories that connect habits and behaviours that make up the culture creation telescope. And a couple of things came out of that. So the values are relatively stable. The organisational values must be stable, and we need to have alignment between the individuals, the leaders, and of course the organisational values as well, if we're going to get the results that we're seeking. So there's got to be that three-way alignment. But what's interesting is with those values and then the vision is, even though the values are relatively stable, the vision can expand because as you walk a mile, you see another mile. And so it's really important to understand that your vision vision doesn't have to be set in stone. What you're trying to create is what you're trying to create for now. And once you achieve that, maybe you'll see another mountaintop that you want to climb. And maybe you'll see something a little bit further afield that you think is worthy of pursuit. And so I think we want to make sure we've got those shared values, the expanding vision, and looking into the future. And again, I think that's a really, really important thing to talk about. I think when it comes to Disney, I said that there's a couple of things that really jumped out. One was really around intentionality and how deliberate and specific they are about how they do things. Nothing is by accident. Again, going back to your patient experience, what is it that you're trying to create? What are the emotions and the feelings that you're trying to create? Disney's obviously trying to create happiness and that sense of being at the happiest place on earth. But what are the emotions and feelings that you're trying to create for your patients? What's the experience that you need to deliver so that people have that emotional connection? Because it's that emotional connection that is what's going to keep people in your practice and telling their family and friends to come and see you. And if you can create that experience consistently and well, then you're going to have a story-worthy practice. And a story-worthy practice is where someone tells your story on your behalf, not just kind of randomly talking about you, but a very specific story that they tell on your behalf. And that's really, really important. So on the topic of stories, storytelling was another thing that really came out in the whole trip, particularly at Disney. Now, we all know Disney tells stories. That's their movies, their TV shows and all the rest of it. But they use storytelling in lots of different ways. They use storytelling in their leadership. They use storytelling in their recruitment. They use storytelling in their marketing. So I think it's really important to talk about stories in your business to your patients, of course, but to your team as well, and engage them with stories, because after all, it's stories that have been used for millennia to teach, to educate, to persuade. And so when it comes to stories, you want to have an origin story. You want to make sure you've got a sales story. You've got to have stories that indicate your values and the habits and behaviors that you want to see that. But most of all, we want to have our team members share their stories too. What I think is really important is those stories create personal, emotional connection between your team. That creates team cohesion. And when you've got team cohesion and alignment of values and people kind of buying into the vision, then you become an unstoppable force. One of the things that I also found really fascinating about Disney was everyone talks about Walt and what a genius he was. Now, there is no doubt that Walt was an incredible genius, but what's interesting when you hear the history of Disney, of course, and many of you will know this, is that prior to Disney being Disney, Walt had an animation studio that went bankrupt. And I think that was in Kansas from memory. And then when he moved out to California to be with his brother Roy, things really clicked. And what's really interesting is Disney would not be Disney without Roy. Roy was the guy that brought order to the magic. He was the guy that made it fiscally achievable. He was the guy that brought structure to the creations. And so every Walt needs a Roy. What I'm talking about here is you need to have creative ideas and creators on your team, but you also need those people that can take those ideas and make them work. You got to make the buses run on time, as I like to say. And so what that means is having someone with a strong operational focus is really important. Now, if you're the practice owner, usually you're the creative one, not necessarily, but often. And if you're the operations manager, practice manager, general manager, whatever title you have, then typically you're the Roy. Now, what's really important for the creator is to make sure that there is a Roy who can have some discipline, some organizational discipline in the practice to make sure we're not kind of just randomly doing stuff. But equally, if you're the Roy, you've got to make sure that the creator's creations get to be heard rather than crushed. Because what I've noticed with a lot of operational things, people, is that they like the detail. They want to know how, why, what, and all the rest of it. And there's 20 questions that come out. A friend of mine likes to call that squashing the butterfly. There's this beautiful butterfly that's just breaking out of its chrysalis. And then the operations person comes along with their 25 questions and they want spreadsheets and answers on every possible thing. And all of a sudden the butterfly just withers and dies and doesn't get to take flight. So if you are the operations person, if you are the Roy, you've got to give that creator a bit of time to let the idea come to life and be mindful not to crush the creativity, because creativity is a really powerful force. Now, we all know that the power of a good idea is only ever in its implementation, but without ideas, there's still no implementation. So you need both, right? And so the creators need to be mindful that the operations guys and girls have a role to play, and the operations guys and girls need to be mindful that there's a creative process in process as well. Anyway, so let's get on to leadership. So Disney really wanted to highlight these 4 key considerations of leadership. So the first one was that great leaders proactively establish values. They're really proactive in establishing them. They create and reinforce the values, and they consistently demonstrate the behaviours that would support those values. And that's really key, is to understand what behaviours support the values, but equally what behaviours would undermine those values. And so I think it's also really important to consider pillar number 2, which was purposeful versus inconsistent. So great leaders actively pursue changes required in the vision. They staunchly defend against threats to the values, which I've alluded to already. Again, it's about being intentional, it's about being purposeful, it's about understanding that the values are our bedrock, but the vision can expand. What I think is really interesting, though, is this concept that Disney talk about, misaligned and aligned. And that really speaks to the situation when the leader's values are misaligned with the organization's. The leader will drown out the organization and you'll get a big culture shift. Where this is really important is really choosing your leadership team very, very carefully. You've got to make sure that when you're promoting people into leadership roles, you promote thoughtfully, and that is really based first and foremost around their values alignment. Skills can be taught, no trouble with that. We can educate people and upskill people that want to be educated and upskilled, but we can't often shift someone's values. And so when you do create your leadership teams, you want to be very thoughtful, you want to be very deliberate, and here's that word again, intentional about how you do that. And so again, really, really important. And we want to make sure when we talk about point number 4 that Disney reiterated was that everyone is considered a leader. And we want to be inclusive in that. And so in our world, we talk about 3 levels of leadership: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary leadership really refers to how you lead yourself. How do you show up? What are you doing every single day? Are you yourself living the values of the organization? Are you being the best version of yourself? So that's really self-leadership. And it reminds me of a book by Robin Sharma called The Leader Who Had No Title. And I'd really encourage everyone to read that if you've not seen it, because it really does talk about that concept of self-leadership. But the second level of leadership we talk about is really about what most people consider traditional leadership, where you have a team of people that you're leading. You're looking to inspire them to buy into the vision and to do the things necessary to fulfill that vision. And so that's what we would typically talk about in terms of leadership. Now, where this type of leadership goes horribly wrong is when you have positional leadership. And I come from a military background, and that is positional leadership all over. That whoever has the most stripes on their shoulder basically carries the most weight, and it's yes sir, no sir, and off you go. And so it's really important that if you're the business owner, to understand that by virtue of the fact that you're the owner, that your voice carries a lot of authority, and it's really important not to drown out other voices. You might not even realize you're doing it, but just by virtue of the position you have, that you might drown out other people. And equally, it's really important that we seek the opinion of those people who might be considered in the organizational structure a little lower down the chain. Now, that doesn't mean that it's less important, far from it. I really believe that in a restaurant, for example, the person who washes the dishes is perhaps one of the most important people in there, because if there's no dishes, there's no food to be served, right? And same in our practice, the person that sterilizes instruments or turns the room around. If that's not happening, then there's no business, right? So we want to make sure we hear from those people. And sometimes they can be a little timid. Sometimes they can be a little overwhelmed, overawed, and feel reluctant to share. And we need to make sure that we're hearing all those voices. So we want inclusive leadership in that area. And the third type of leadership is really what we call tertiary leadership, and that's where we're developing leaders. And this is where, if you're going to scale your practice, this is something that you want to become very, very good at. This is where you're looking to bring out the best in people, to train them to think like you, to make decisions on your behalf. And it doesn't come by telling, it often comes by asking. And so it comes by engaging in conversation, listening to what's happening, asking questions. And when people come to you with a question rather than providing them an answer, it's about asking them, well, what do they think the right answer is? Or what do you think I'm considering? Or what do you think the risks that I'm worried about are? Or whatever it happens to be. And it goes from being the font of all information to empowering your team there. And if you want to develop other leaders, you want them to be able to think for themselves, to make decisions that are in the best interest of the practice and the organization at large. And so we need to give them the latitude to make those decisions, but some training on what those decision-making processes are. So Disney was an exceptional experience. on lots of different levels. And I've only just scratched the surface of all the things we could talk about with Disney. I think Disney is a remarkable organization, and certainly one worthy of study on lots of different levels, how they develop leaders, how they promote leaders, and even, dare I say, how they remove people from their teams that aren't a fit. They have a lovely saying called upgrading them to guest, and I really thought that was lovely. Rather than saying we're going to fire them, we're going to kick them to the curb, we're going to terminate them, it's just upgrading to guest. And I think it's a really nice way of thinking about it, because that doesn't mean they're not welcome to go to Disney and experience things as a customer. But it means that perhaps from a career point of view, there are other opportunities that are more suited to that person. And what I like about Disney and the way they do that is they handle that with grace. They handle that in the knowledge that there is a person on the end of that conversations whose feelings and thoughts need to be considered. Now, that's not always easy, because sometimes people misbehave badly and you need to kind of take some steps to excise them from the organization. But as a thought process and as an ethos, I really like that idea. But as I said, there's a ton of things that you can learn from Disney, the way that the stores are set out, the way the buying experience occurs, the pricing structure, the price elasticity that they've created, how they go about living up to the happiest place on earth moniker, and the things that they need to do to achieve that every single day. And what happens if someone has a disappointing experience? How do they rectify that? How do they make sure that person's experience is improved and ultimately rescued so that that person leaves with the best possible outcome? So again, there's a lot in there. So Disney, amazing, fantastic experience. And if you have the opportunity to go there and experience the Disney park and then go to the Disney Institute, then I'd recommend it. It was really great. What was great on our trip is we got to experience it as a community. And 26 of us going around doing that. Community is our highest value in Savvy Dentist. It's one of our core values. And it's why everything that we do is all about community. When we went on that trip and we got to experience that together, what was amazing out of that is, even though each of us had our own lessons, we learned as much from each other's lessons and insights as anything. And that was a tremendous period of reflection, a tremendous period of growth. And what I'm noticing with the people that have been through that experience now is because they're thinking a little bit differently. They're thinking a little bit outside dentistry. They're thinking, what would Walt do here? Or what would Roy do here? What's the Disney version of this, or the Zappos, or the Pike Place Markets? They're thinking differently. And so this whole purpose of this trip was to expand horizons, to broaden horizons, and to show our community that some of the greatest ideas will never come from dentistry. In fact, my humble belief is that most of the great ideas will come outside of dentistry, because when we think about dentistry, it is a fairly closed world that we operate in, and sometimes it becomes a bit of an echo chamber. And even if you go into various conversations and Facebook groups or other communities elsewhere, it's often the same sort of stuff being spoken about. So to get out of that bubble, to go and see something different and to kind of expand the horizons is really liberating. So if you have the opportunity to do that, I'd encourage you to grab it with both hands, start thinking about these things and how you can apply them to your own practice, because I promise you'll come up with some wonderful innovations. You'll come up with some wonderful things that not only improve your bottom line, but they'll free up your time, but they'll also just really help you enjoy that experience that bit more. Lots to share, lots to talk about, but I hope that's been helpful to give you a bit of a debrief of our road trip. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Savvy Dentist podcast. So that's it from me. Take good care. And as we like to say, we'll see you on the flip side. Bye now.
Thank you for listening to the Savvy Dentist podcast. For more episodes, go to drjessiegreen.com/savvydentist. And to discover how to build a high-performance dental practice, visit drjessiegreen.com and download the free report.